Hi, welcome to A Leftist Reacts, and today we are reacting to a couple of United States Cold War propaganda films. Our first film is called The Responsibilities of American Citizenship. So we start off with a little bit of American exceptionalism, a little bit of American myth-making about how freedom and liberty are ingrained in American society. It's a nice gesture. It's one of those ones that's beat into every single American student's head about how it is great to have American citizenship and how the freedoms that we enjoy in America are unique to the world. Of course, they're not unique, especially now in 2025. There are definitely countries that can be considered, quote, freer than the United States in a lot of ways, especially under late-stage capitalism.
We are living in an era marked by the growth of socialism. To a substantial degree, in one form or another, socialism has spread the shadow of human regimentation over most of the nations of the earth, and the shadow is encroaching upon our own liberty.
Okay, and then we are introduced to the big bad, the threat to American society, which is socialism. Now, of course, this is a kind of a ridiculous notion, but you still have a lot of Americans believe this today about how they don't necessarily know what socialism or communism is. They use them interchangeably. They don't know what either system is. However, they know that this system is bad, and that's all they know is that it's, quote, bad, and that it's, a threat to American society, which is the capitalist society. Now, socialism is a threat to capitalist society, but I would not necessarily say that it is a threat to American society. Americans, we do have some forms of socialism that are in this country, that are embedded in this country already. And it's not a stretch to say that socialism in general is not a threat. It's not an ongoing threat. You can be a socialist and live in America. There's a lot of socialists that live in America, myself included. So it's definitely one of those things that is kind of hilarious to look at as a threat when, some of the ideals that are considered American ideals are also socialist ideas. So this is actually talking more about the Soviet model of socialism, which you could argue definitely had a lot of issues, notwithstanding the whole dictatorship thing. And this is where a lot of Americans, this is their only introduction to socialism, is the Soviet model that was under Stalin in particular. And this particular film is talking about that model, which sets it up as the big bad.
The socialists among us seek to bring about a gradual change in our system by gradually destroying the principle of the private ownership of property and substituting the socialist principle of government ownership.
So socialism isn't necessarily about government ownership. Communism can be about the communal ownership of, and involving the government, but not necessarily that either. That's an incorrect statement. Socialism is defined by having communal property, but the communal property is among a part of a whole. So it would be a bunch of people or a bunch of individuals together owning something collectively, not necessarily the government per se owning something. It's the people who own something, or it would be a particular group of people. So like, for instance, you would have labor unions, how labor unions are set up, where it is a collective bargaining effort between all of the workers, and how all of the workers might have some form of ownership with the means of production that happen, the labor that happens. So the labor that happens with in labor unions is a collective effort of all of the workers that are there. It's not necessarily involving the government whatsoever.
We know that under the stars and stripes, we have more freedom than do civilized people on earth. Our nation, although containing only 6% of the land area and 7% of the population of the world, produces 42% of the world's wealth. We know that the average American in all walks of life has a living standard twice as high as the best in Europe, where socialism is widespread, and from 5 to 10 times better than in the communist countries, such as Russia and China. And if we remember our previous lessons, we know that this economic abundance is possible in America because incentives for progress and the other factors built into our dynamic private enterprise system have enabled us to utilize our resources to the fullest extent.
So this is the typical Americans' lives are better due to capitalism argument. During the post-war era, which this is the post-war era, you could argue that American life was effectively better, at least for a certain section of Americans, particularly white Americans. Not necessarily for anybody else, but definitely for white straight Americans. They were living on top of the world in the 1950s, which is why a lot of politicians and a lot of right-wing pundits today want to harken back to this era, which was already an era that was, it was an unprecedented era. It was an era that was out of the norm for American history anyway. But a lot of what led to America to be a superpower post-World War II has a lot more to do with the economic factors that happened in the aftermath of World War II. While America was in the war, we weren't necessarily part of any of the battlegrounds that were fought during World War II. So America did happen, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, happened to leave the war a little bit unscathed. And, it wasn't like the UK where there was the Blitz. It wasn't like places in Russia, places in Poland and in Germany, so you could argue that America, the way that it was able to get on top was because it escaped a lot of the violence that would have been directly affecting in World War II. You could also argue that because America was in total war, the entire economy revolved around the war, that helped give the economy a boost. But of course, me and a lot of other people believe the economy is ultimately fake. There's too many factors that go about in keeping the economy afloat, where, this prosperous nation here, it's kind of, it's all fake. It's all fake. It's propaganda, capitalist propaganda, and prosperity is one of those things that is a subjective thing. You could argue that America was prosperous, but not all Americans were prosperous in this period.
The world is caught in an era of socialist expansion. Most of the nations are affected, and America is a target. In fact, the number one target of both the socialist and the communist. If we permit our great system to crumble through the apathy of our citizenship, we shall lose not only our freedom, but our prosperity and our still brighter future.
We have empty words here. If we don't fight this socialist and communist takeover, we will, quote, lose our freedom. And then, what is freedom? What are we actually losing as far as if we were to become more socialist, more communist? What freedom would we lose? Freedom is almost an empty word in American society. It doesn't mean much. It means whatever people want it to mean. A socialist would say, well, freedom would be you're not under the economic strain of having to find housing or having to find food or having to find health care. Those things would be taken care of, and you would have more freedom to, spend time with your family. You would have more freedom to just enjoy life the way life is meant to be enjoyed, if you weren't under the economic strain of trying to find housing, trying to find food, trying to find health care.
Our freedom stems from the fact that America is a republic, founded on a constitution, and dedicated to the principle of democracy and the worth of the individual. The people rule. But some philosophers tell us that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. In other words, food, the material things of life, are dear to the heart. we should understand that our form of government is a republic, not a pure democracy. And we should clearly understand the difference. Who can tell us the difference in a few words?
A pure democracy establishes majority rule with a minority overrun.
So the United States is a republic and not a democracy argument. It is true that the United States is a republic, but capitalists hinge on this fact that it is a republic and not a democracy, because a democracy would introduce the majority, which would be the poor people, people who do not own property. They would have a larger voice in government and what's going on in the country. They would have the larger voice versus a republic, which would have the representatives speak for the quote unquote majority of people while protecting minority rights. And a lot of those minority rights just happen to be people who own property. You could say that the rights of the property owners are far more protected than the rights of individual citizens in the United States.
It's important, too, that in our republic, authority is surrounded by an ingenious system of checks and balances that prevents autocratic or dictatorial rule. That is, if we maintain the Constitution as our basic law.
So, about those checks and balances that supposedly exist, it was a nice idea, at least for 250 years, but now those checks and balances have failed. And we do have a leader who wants to be a dictator. He even claimed that he would be a dictator on day one. He doesn't shirk the idea of dictatorship and likes it quite a bit. And he has not only stacked the court with people who agree with him, the Supreme Court with people who agree with him, he also has his party that's in power in the legislative branch that basically gives him whatever he wants. So those checks and balances have failed. It was a nice idea that we would have this fail-safe in our government, but recent events have shown that this fail-safe doesn't exist.
Our economic system is based on three major principles: private ownership of property, the profit motive, and the competitive open market.
Yes, those are the three great pillars.
So private ownership does not make independence. Independence is brought about by not being a wage slave. I mean, that's just the simpleness of it. So there's the use of private property, and then there's the use of personal property. Your house is personal property. Your car is personal property. Anything that you actually use is personal property. Private property is more about owning the factory or owning a business or something, or being a landlord. So those are properties where, you would be doing a little bit of rent seeking with those. And those are what socialism are trying to not eliminate entirely, but definitely diminish. And why I say don't eliminate entirely is you do have different economic systems within socialism that may take into effect that, hey, you could have multiple properties as a communal idea, not necessarily as an individual. But let's say, for instance, a family owns a bunch of properties. Those properties are used by the family. That would be fine under a socialist society. It would still be considered more personal property versus private property. But you could argue that this family owns these 5 or 6 houses to be used by the particular family, by individuals in that family. That is usually fine within socialist society. What socialists don't want to happen is we don't want capitalism run amok. We don't want people who own 95% of the wealth in a particular country, because that wealth is stolen labor.
To understand communism, its basic godless philosophy, its goal of world conquest, its insidious tactics, and its cunning strategy.
We slipped in a little bit of godlessness in there for communism. I think this was a sticking point a lot in the 1950s for a lot of people, was that There was a state atheism, not really, but there was a state atheism that was in the Soviet Union. In the mind of the American person, of the American individual in the 1950s, they equate that to socialism and communism. In reality, there are socialisms that are under religious beliefs. You know, you have Jewish socialism, you have Christian socialism, you have Islamic socialism. You do have socialisms that work within religious frameworks. They're not necessarily atheists in ideas. A lot of communists do happen to be atheists. A lot of socialists do happen to be atheists. You have this idea that there is no religion that can be practiced in tangent with communism and socialism. It's a flawed idea, especially in the United States, when we're not supposed to have a state religion at all. We do have the First Amendment that says that we have the right to whatever religion we want to be, or no religion at all. So to mention this godless concept is kind of setting it up as all Americans believe in God. I mean, all Americans do not believe in God, obviously.
Number 3 on our list of obligations is to understand socialism and all the cunning disguises in which it presents itself to the American people. Our 4th obligation is to understand propaganda techniques as used by both the communist and the socialist. This is a very vitally important need. Thousands of good, loyal Americans have been duped into actually aiding the communists simply because they did not look carefully before they joined some high-sounding venture or before they more or less blindly advocated some course of action.
Notice that they've never defined what communism or socialism is. It's just considered a big bad, something that is against American society and that is a threat to American society. We don't have any definitions of what they actually are.
Number 5 in the list of American citizenship obligations is to take an interest in your public schools and in your private and public financed colleges. To take an interest in what's being taught and how it's being taught.
We also have a call here, a call for monitoring of the education system, making sure that kids in public school and private universities and public and private universities do not teach socialist and communist ideas. Definitely something that we have today, where you have the right-wing politicians wanting to control education, and they really want education to be just the very basics, enough for you to be a very good worker in American society. Not necessarily to expand your mind or to do any critical thinking beyond what is being taught right now to kids, to make sure that they can be very good factory workers, or not even factory workers at this point, but just very good service workers to serve the political elite.
Strive constantly for spiritual growth. We as individuals can push the world along toward mankind's highest destiny if each of us will make the welfare of his fellow man his first concern.
So the strive for spiritual growth definition that they have here, where you are your brother's keeper and making sure that everyone strives to be a better part of themselves. That's kind of socialist when you say. Capitalists believe in the collective when it benefits them, and only when it benefits them. Otherwise, they want to make sure that everybody is individually an island. They don't want collective bargaining. They don't need or want collective anything that have to do with giving poor people power over them as property owners.
Is it too much to ask that we fulfill these obligations of citizenship? If we think so, we should read again the history of the founding of this nation and consider the hardships of the people who made possible our freedom. They felt that no challenge was too great if freedom was at stake. That spirit carried them on. It created for us the foundation of our great heritage.
We got a little bit of American myth making here. So yeah, the responsibilities of American citizenship. You know, basically some things that socialists also agree with, which is being involved in your community, being involved in government, being involved in education system. Of course, different paths definitely different paths. Definitely not monitoring the education system to make sure that no socialism or communism ideas come forward. But these are the same ideas that socialists and communists believe. Monitoring of the education system to make sure that education system is actually teaching what it's supposed to be teaching, making sure that government serves the political the people as it should, and making sure and holding our representatives responsible, making sure that every American citizen making sure that their rights are not violated or that their rights are not taken away, making sure that the communities that you have can take care of its own. These are all socialist ideas. The next thing that we're watching is called Face to Face with Communism, and it was made by the DoD for the Department of the Air Force. So, first thing we see here is a guy coming to grab the mail, to censor the mail. Not necessarily about communism, but we'll watch. And so now he's trying to call his girlfriend, but he doesn't have the proper permit, quote unquote, to get the long distance call permitted. Again, their frame of reference for communism is Soviet Russia. And Soviet Russia may have had some things that were definitely controlling of the citizens. Stalinism controlled the citizens, and definitely, there's no doubt about that. But it's not necessarily communism. But this is waking up, deciding today that you are in the USSR under Stalin. And now you are, subjected to the rules automatically overnight. And then you have this guy who's a rube here who didn't read the paper, who would have known that, quote, this is now communist Russia, if he would have just read the paper from the little boy.
Private operation of hotels, banks, stores, and services will be permitted only at the discretion of the Council of People's Commissars.
So a change like this would not happen overnight. This would be more of a gradual change, or you would see it coming a mile away. You wouldn't have this sudden overnight. You would have this change in American society. And again, they're talking about Soviet Russia. They're not talking about communism in general. They may be also talking a little bit about China, but this is clearly from Russia. You would have known all of these changes would have come. This is kind of one of those films where it's probably all a dream that this guy is going through. We're going through this particular world with him, and he's just not getting it. He's not getting that he's under a new regime, a regime that, quite frankly, is definitely supposed to be terrifying to the average American citizen.
Now on, the welfare of the people's state comes first. Most of you misguided people have been living under a reactionary capitalist democracy for so long that you find it difficult to understand what we mean by the welfare of the people's state. The people's state is you.
Not me, brother. Not me. You might be fooling some of those jokers with this people's state routine, but not me. Why doesn't somebody do something? Why don't they call the cops? Yeah, the cops.
Oh man, I love that this guy's first reaction is, I'm not part of the system and someone needs to call the cops. If that is not a right-wing reactionary, I don't know what to say. Like, I have no notes. He wants to call the cops, and he doesn't think he's part of the system. He thinks he's exempt from the system.
Remember, the future of the people's state is your future. You must think, act, and live for the state. The people of this community have waited a long time for the right kind of leadership. Now that you have it, remember that the people's state is your state only if you give it your full and unswerving cooperation in its fight for freedom.
So the existence of Stalin's Soviet Russia has poisoned socialism and communism for a lot of people in this country. it was a dictatorial state. He did have a tight control of the state. He did make people disappear that did not agree with him and did agree with the party. It was a terrible place to live. You could argue that it had some advantages, such as the space program, and then also the fact that, most Soviet people, I think all Soviet people, no one was homeless, and then everybody did eat in the Soviet Union. But you have this idea that the control that Stalin puts into the state, that equals communism or that equals socialism. And you're not going to separate the two in a lot of Americans' minds. You have this communist flag covering up military names of people who, quote, fought for freedom. That's a pretty interesting symbol to have in this Department of Defense film.
Violation of State Code, Article 47, Section 6, Paragraph 4, respecting private ownership of commercial enterprise, engaged in retail sale and distribution of essential commodities without government permit.
Has the defendant confessed to these crimes?
Yes?
The defendant is sentenced to an indefinite term in State Labor Camp 14.
But I didn't confess. I didn't say a word. Is it wrong to sell bread? I demand that...
So you have communists sending somebody to a state labor camp as punishment for selling bread. I guess he's a baker. This is just straight up propaganda, pure and simple. There's no real way to explain this away or to analyze this any further. It's straight propaganda. There's nothing that says that, communists will send people to state labor camps if you don't comply with, selling bread. Bread has to still be sold. Commerce still happens in Soviet society, in communist society. You still have commerce happening. It's not happening. What it is whether or not you are allowed to price, whether or not you are allowed to rig the prices in your favor in order to exploit people when you're selling that bread. That's the issue, not necessarily selling bread itself, especially if it's your own labor of bread. So the crimes that this guy is accused of, these still happen in American society. We still have trumped up charges. We still have a state police, or, we have ICE right now that are locking people up without due process. We still have all of these happening without the threat of a communist takeover. This still happens. This isn't unique to, being under communism. This happens to a lot of Americans already. The issue is whether or not it happens to white Americans versus happening it to everyone else. You have indigenous Americans and you have black Americans that have already dealt with a system like this where they are arrested under trumped up charges, where they are, not given due process. You already have this in the United States. This is not unique to a communist society.
You don't seriously think you're going to get Americans to go communist, do you? Not with all those benefits you've been handing out. The trouble with you and all your crowd is you think that you can make people act like puppets while you dangle them on that worn-out string of ideas that should have been buried along with the guy that invented them. Oh, you mugs are living back in the 19th century with the bustle skirts and mutton chop whiskers. You're just about as old-fashioned as my grandmother's corsets.
You seem to know a great deal about us.
You ain't kidding.
That's an interesting comparison, living in the 19th century when, right-wing politicians and right-wing pundits and right-wing people in the United States want to live the ideas of 18th century guys. We talk about the Constitution as if it's something that cannot be rewritten or cannot be redrawn. I think it's interesting how this is set up as he already hated the communists. He didn't need any convincing to know that this is a bad system. Again, because this is the Department of Defense that's making this. So they already would have been educated enough to know why communism is bad. So he just rejects the system outright. He doesn't and thinks that the guys who fought for the freedom either died or would have forgotten their training. So they would have been re-educated to think that communism is good. Something that, as a person who's in the Department of Defense, who's in the Air Force here, he would have been taught the opposite, that communism is bad, and there's no real reason why he would know, or no real reason why he would think that communism is bad other than he was told that it was.
Oh.
I think it was while he was just able to just walk out of the jail like that, just with no guards or anything. That seems out of the ordinary, even for this that's supposed to be communist propaganda, that he was supposed to be under a police state. There were no police around to make sure that he stayed in the cell. Now he's seeing the town goes right back to normal. Now you see all the happiness in the street. You even see a child hawking a newspaper because, child labor is okay under the capitalist society.
Morning, Sergeant. How are you feeling today?
Say, aren't you the man that...
That's right. I'm the judge that sentenced you to death. I see you're still alive. When we first talked it over, a lot of the fellows shouted it down. But it wasn't necessary. A bunch of us thought it was. Always seemed to me no better way to show a community how it'd be if the communists took over than to act it out. Don't you think so?
Yeah.
Fella said I did a swell job with that legal language. My lawyer wrote it out for me. You did a swell job too, young fella. You looked as though you swallowed it all. Hook, line, and sinker.
Did I?
You certainly did.
It was all just a trick. Yeah. It's a scenario of whether it would be like under the communists.
I guess they keep you boys pretty well informed. I could tell by the way you tore into me. I guess it's part of your training.
What would you say?
I was wondering whether knowing all the answers the way you did was part of your training.
Oh, sure.
Well, if all the people understood things the way you did, that stage revolution wouldn't have been necessary.
So when the United States military educates you on the threat to communism, that's good. But if the Soviets educate you on the threats of capitalism, that's bad. That's what we're getting here, right? Okay, and then that's the face-to-face with communism. Yeah, I might do more of these later, but I think that's a good stopping point for now. Thank you for watching.